Welcome to the Oxford Clay Pottery podcast. I'm Catherine Tomlinson and I founded an eco-conscious pottery company called Oxford Clay. Now, I don't just make pottery, I make resources such as books and courses for other potters who want to be more eco-conscious in their pottery practice. And that's what this podcast is all about. It's about me sharing everything I've learned with you, and I can't wait to get started. Let's go. Hello, so before we get on with the episode, I wanted to tell you about two completely free guides that I've made just for you about pottery. And the first guide is called How to Make a Pottery Glaze. So if you've ever been curious about how to make your own pottery glaze, this guide will show you exactly how to make your own glaze from start to finish. It tells you all the ingredients you need. It tells you step by step how to make the glaze, how to stay safe when glaze making, and it's got a stoneware glaze recipe in there. And if you've been curious about how to fire pottery, I have also made a guide on electric kiln firing. So this guide will tell you all the different terms that's used in like kiln firing, and what they mean, and it also takes you through the exact firing schedule that I use to do my bisque firing and also stoneware glaze firing. So it's got all the temperatures in there, all the timings in there, and both of these guides are available from the Oxford Clay website at www.oxfordclay.co.uk/resources for potters. Okay, let's get on with the episode. Hello and welcome back to the Oxford Clay Pottery podcast. I'm Catherine Tomlinson, and in today's episode, I'm going to be talking to you about how to make your own clay. So I make my own clay, and it's not necessarily something that like all potters do, or all potters would really want to do. Like when I was like just throwing, making pots, throwing on the wheel, like making my own clay wasn't really something that I kind of wanted to do, like necessarily like needed to do or anything. So the reason I make my own clay now is because I actually I make my own casting slip, and then what I do after I've made casting slip and like there's like scraps of the slip, is I then recycle those little scraps of slip into clay, and I actually use that clay for throwing my pots. So it's kind of like once was a slip and then goes into a kind of proper sort of clay body that I just use for my general pottery. So that's what I'm going to be talking to you really about in this episode. We're going to be talking about, first of all, just some reasons like why potters might want to make their own clay. Like I said, it's not something necessarily that lots of people would be doing, or most potters would do. But yeah, I just wanted to talk to you about the process in case that was something that you thought like, oh, that sounds interesting. Maybe I'll have a go. So so the first thing to say is that when I was first learning to do pottery, I thought that clay was basically like dug out of the ground, and then it was that you basically made pottery out of. And like whilst that kind of does happen, like you can there's like some really cool things I've read in books about people like digging clay up from like riverbanks and stuff, and then like using that as in their pottery work. That's kind of like natural clay that you find yourself. Whilst that you can do that, and that does happen, most clay these days, like commercial clay, is actually like a mixture of different clays and rocks, crushed rocks so rocks are crushed into powder, they're mixed with water, they're mixed with other clays, ball clays, china clays, and then that combination is the clay that you basically find in the pottery supplier. So yeah, right. So that's the first thing to say, is that clay isn't really clay as such. It's kind of a combination of loads of different clays, loads of different rocks. And so that is essentially what we're talking about today. We're talking about like the making, the kind of the mixture of those things into clay into some potters refer to it as a clay body. So the clay body can actually be a mixture of loads of different things. So right, why on earth would a potter make their own clay? It's like, what a palaver. Seems like such a, hard job. Why would you bother? So, well, some potters want a very specific colour to their clay. I spoke to a potter once at the Oxford Ceramics Fair. I think I've said this before on the podcast. And they said, oh, I only use porcelain from this part of the world because it's like, the specific colour I want. Whereas like other porcelain has a kind of slight yellowy tinge or something. So I use like this special porcelain from a certain part of the world. So some potters are very, in terms of their aesthetic, they want a very specific colour to their work, or again, this could work with like texture. So they want a very specific texture for their work. They might say, for example, if they're hand building and they want something which is like got a really rough texture that really goes with their, the art piece that they're making, they might want like a clay, called crank, which is very kind of gritty, got lots of grit or grog in it. So grog basically is when clay is fired and then it's ground up into a powder and then it's added back into wet clay and it just adds a real strength to the clay. So quite often clays that you'll be like hand building with, they will have like either grit or sand or grog added, and that's for strength. And then generally clays that you're throwing with, they'll be very smooth because you don't want to like hurt your hands with the grit, grog, sand as you're throwing. So potters could want a specific colour, they could want a specific texture for their clay, for the aesthetics, or it could be that they want certain properties because, say, for example, a certain clay is like stronger, just as like we were talking about just now. Like it could be that they're building a very big piece and they need a very strong clay with lots of grit grog in, or they're making something very small and delicate on the wheel and they need a clay which can withstand being very thin on the wheel or taking lots of water. So they need a kind of like a strong clay with no grit in. So it's like it really depends on like what kind of work potters are making. And the really good thing is that loads of clays have already been designed to meet potters' specific needs by pottery suppliers. So there's various companies, and they make clays, they make mixtures of all these different rocks, and like I was saying at the beginning, rocks and different clays, different substances together, grog, grit, sand, to make clays which are specific have specific uses that potters need. So if you're ever not sure, you can always speak to a pottery supplier and they'll just say to you, oh, this one's really good, or this is the color of this one. I went to a pottery shop when I was buying my kiln. The shop I went to was so fantastic. They had each type of clay that they sold, they had a fired version of it, and then they had a version of it which was glazed with a transparent glaze, because sometimes clay can sort of change colour slightly. Say like the colour can get a bit more, sort of stronger when it's underneath a glaze. So that was so good because you could see what colour it was fired, you could see what texture it was fired, you could see what colour it was with a glaze on top, and it was so helpful. So you could just look at all these different ones, and you could and then they had labels on to say like what supplier it was and what kind of what clay it was, what it was called, and then that's how you could just pick your clay from those ones already made up, in bags. They usually come in bags of like 12.5 kilograms when you buy clay, commercial clay. Okay, so those are some reasons why potters would make their own clay. And another reason is that, and these are the two reasons that I make my own clay. So the first one is that it's cheaper for me to make my own clay. And the reason for that is because I use my clay for slip casting. Slip can be quite expensive. It can be quite expensive to transport. It's quite a specialist thing to get, made up by a pottery supplier. They have it in stock. They kind of, make it up with the right chemicals and stuff, because you need a chemical in slip called a deflocculant. to make the clay runny. So effectively what you're doing is you're making a clay, sticky clay, and then you're adding a chemical called a deflocculant. I use sodium silicate, and I put, hardly any in, a few drops of that in, a little tiny bit, and then it kind of it's incredible. It turns the clay from a kind of sticky, like hard clay substance into this beautiful flowing liquid that you can then pour into molds for slip casting. So I don't have to, by making up my own slip, I don't have to pay for the transportation of all that water, because a lot of the clay, the weight of it is water. So I don't have to pay for the transportation of it. I don't have to pay somebody else's labor to make up that slip, because I've learned to do it myself, and all the labor involved in actually doing it. And another reason is that I don't have to have any CO2 emissions from like haulage or from the transportation of that product to me from the pottery supplier. So and like I was saying to you, a lot of that is just going to be transporting the water. Okay, so that's one reason that I make up my own slip. And so the second reason that I make my own clay, I can make my own slip, is that I want to know exactly what is going into my slip. So I want to know exactly what the ingredients are, and I want to know where they come from. And by selecting carefully each ingredient that goes into my slip, I know that I have sourced that material for as lower environmental impact as possible. So, for example, so I go into this more in the books I've written basically on eco-conscious pottery and eco-conscious glaze making, where I just talk about how, as a potter, you can find out more about the materials you're using. And I focus on different materials, and I talk about how generally to know how the environmental and social impact of a pottery material, how to find that out, some great sources of information. And also I just go through a lot of really common pottery materials and their environmental impact basically. So I know that the ingredients I've selected for my slip have as low environmental impact as possible, and that is why I make my own pottery slip. So, okay, so let's get on to the bit, which is actually about how you actually make your own clay. Okay, so we know that clay is made not just from clay, it's made from loads of different ingredients, okay? And we know that different clays are, for different purposes. So the one I'm going to tell you about today is the clay that I use as pottery slip. And then, like I was saying to you at the beginning, I then turn that clay, I reclaim it into just a usable clay. So the way that I do that is, in the beginning, when I'm making my slip, I use a chemical called a deflocculant, and that makes the clay into a runny liquid. But then by the time it's gone through the slip casting process and I'm, reclaiming those scraps, when I actually reclaim the scraps, the deflocculant is no longer working, and I can then just reclaim it back into like a usable state, just in the same way that other potters would like reclaim their clay. So they would put it all out on like a board or something to dry. I just put mine out on like wooden boards and just dry it and turn it, and eventually it dries into a usable state again, and then I can just use it for throwing. I use it to make like little designs on my pots. I press it into a silicone mold. So you can then just, you can roll it out, use it to build for slab pots, so then it's just like normal clay. Okay, so that's what's so magical about clay, isn't it? You can just keep on reusing it for loads of different loads of different reasons, loads of different things, and then you can just pop it back into the reclaiming bin and reclaim it again. So this is how I make my clay in the first place, and I make it with the raw ingredients. So basically I buy these ingredients from a pottery supplier, and they come as powders. So they've already been they're rocks and clays which have already been processed, crushed into a powder. The rock has been mined, crushed into a powder. The clays have been processed and made back into like clay particles, which are just a kind of powdered clay. Okay, so if you're interested in this recipe, then you can find it in Eco-Friendly Pottery, which is a book available from the Oxford Clay website and also Amazon. And it's 30 simple ways to make your pottery practice more ethical and sustainable. So yeah, this slip recipe is in that book that I'm going to cover today. So, okay, so the first thing I do is that I put on my FFP3 face mask. So when you're working with any powders in pottery, you have to wear an FFP3 face mask. So other face masks that are like a lower safety standard, they're not going to protect your lungs from powdered clay. Powdered clay, powdered rocks, you don't want to get them in your lungs, okay? They can cause kind of like sort of long-term health problems. They can really damage your lungs. So it's really, really important to protect your body when you're making clay. So the first thing I do is I put that on and then I weigh out all my ingredients. And if you want the quantities, they're in Eco-Friendly Pottery 30 Simple Ways to Make Your Pottery Practice More Ethical and Sustainable. They're in that book, but I'm just going to go through the ingredients now, and so you can see like what goes into clay. Okay, so in the clay, we've got China clay, and my specific China clay is from Cornwall in England. So China clay comes from all over the world, and you can pick, you know, a China clay. There might be one like really close to you that's mined close to you, and there's various deposits across the world. And the one that I found like closest to me was Groleg China clay in Cornwall, and Groleg China clay is just fantastic. It's a very light China clay. It's a really interesting substance. It's so interesting when you've got all these different powders and they're quite different, and China clay is quite sort of fluffy light powder, so it seems like you need a lot of it, but it's, you know, when you're kind of measuring it out, but it's just because it's so light and kind of like voluminous basically. So I use China clay. So I measure that out. And the next ingredient is quartz. So the opposite of China clay, although quartz is like a very similar kind of colour, it's very kind of dense and heavy. So this is just quartz rock mined from the ground, crushed into a powder. The one I use is from Belgium. And so I measure that out, and it's got quite a lot. It's quite a large percentage of the clay that I make, my slip, is quartz. Okay, so the next ingredient is feldspar. So again, feldspar is a rock, and it's crushed into a powder by the pottery, like by the processors. It's bought by a pottery supplier, and then I buy it from them. And the one I use is FFF feldspar. So this is from Europe. So different times I've got it from different kind of countries in Europe. I found FFF feldspar to be a really perfect feldspar to use in slip. So there's lots of different feldspar rocks, and I've spoken about this before on the podcast. And some feldspars have a lower melting temperature. So, for example, soda feldspar has a lower melting temperature than potash feldspar, which has got a higher melting temperature. And so this can cause kind of issues in your if you're making clay from different feldspars, because if you're making a stoneware clay, then your feldspar will need to be a higher melting feldspar so that your pot doesn't start melting in the kiln at the higher the higher temperatures. So I used to make my casting slip from soda feldspar, and then what has happened was I just started to get so much warping in my pottery, and so I realised that actually part of that problem was because the clay was starting to melt at the very, very high stoneware temperatures in the kiln. So I switched to a higher melting feldspar, and FFF feldspar was like the perfect kind of melting temperature. So I've had like no problems with warping since then, which is so good since switching to that one. So that's the one I use. Again, it's like a white powder. I just measure it out. Again, I have to use quite a lot. So again, like quartz, those are the two kind of some of the main ingredients in the casting slip. And then the next thing I use is ball clay. So I actually use 3 different types of ball clay. Now, like using 3 different types of ball clay is probably could be conceptualized as being maybe like overcomplicating the slip recipe. But I've just found these different three types as like really a really great combination, because different ball clays have different properties. So some are kind of coloured with iron a little bit, and just naturally occurring iron. Some are very strong. Some are very smooth. So like different ones will give you different properties in your clay. So I have found this to be like my ideal combination, but like you can just make clay with like one type of ball clay. But okay, so the different types of ball clay I use are high mod ball clay, high plas ball clay, and then a ball clay which is called blue ball clay. And those three combined, they're all from southwest England, Dorset and Devon. And yeah, they're like a great combination. I love the colour of them. I love the strength of them. They have great sort of plasticity. They're great for throwing with. They're great for making the slip with. So I found them to be like all round, just the qualities I need. The colour is lovely. So they're fantastic in the slip. And then the next two ingredients are right. So I talk about this so much on the podcast, and basically I add paper to my clay and it makes clay really, really strong. So this next ingredient might seem a bit bizarre, but it's actually kitchen roll. So I use sheets of kitchen roll that I rip up, and then I add it to the water, which I add to the clay. And it just makes the clay really, really strong. So I make it into a kind of paper pulp first. I kind of like zhuzh it with a stick blender. And then what I do is I then add the water and paper pulp and the blended kitchen roll basically to my casting slip, and then that makes the casting slip like super strong, and it's absolutely brilliant. It stops cracking. It can help to stop warping. It's just it's really good. It makes your work really, really strong. You can even glaze it at the greenware stage if you're using paper clay. Okay, so the final ingredient that I measure out is some sodium silicate. And this is, like I was saying to you, casting slip needs a chemical called a deflocculant. So that's what sodium silicate does. It basically makes the clay from a kind of hard, sticky clay substance into like a runny clay, which is just incredible. Like the process of it happening is just amazing to watch. You just look, and you hardly need any sodium silicate as well. So sodium silicate is something you can get from pottery suppliers, and like I was saying, you hardly need any amount at all, and you add it to your ingredients. You've got the water in there, you've got all the dry powders in there, and you just give it a really, really good mix. So you're just mixing. It usually takes me, probably even about 15 minutes of mixing with a paddle mixer to get a clay into like a nice smooth consistency. And what you can do as well is that you can then sieve your clay afterwards. So once you think it's all completely mixed, it'll be a kind of lovely liquid. If it seems a bit stiff, I can add a teeny weeny bit more water, but I always make sure that I don't add any more deflocculant, because it's very easy to like over deflocculate your clay, your casting slip. And when I've done that before, basically it turns it from a liquid back into a solid again. So you're like, no, and there's kind of I haven't found a good way of like undoing that process. So I mix it with a paddle mixer, maybe add a little tiny bit more water, keep on mixing it. And then the next part of the process is I then sieve it to make sure there's no like lumps, because when you pour casting slip, you want it to be like really, really smooth, really even. You don't want any lumps in there, because that's obviously going to like affect your pot. It's going to like make it look like not good. It's going to have like lumps of clay in and stuff like that. So you want it really, really smooth, really even consistency. And that's it really. That's how to make your own clay. So So after I've used my clay for casting, like I mentioned at the beginning, what I do is I take all those scraps and I just put them in a reclaiming bin, and then I can reclaim that clay back into usable clay. So I just reclaim it and I like wedge it, and then I can use it for throwing. I store it in plastic bags, and then I can just use it for throwing. So that's essentially how to make your own clay. And if you wanted to just make your own clay, you didn't want to make your own casting slip, you can basically leave out the defloculant part of it. You would just have to, it would just be more difficult for you to mix it basically. But you could definitely still do it. So you could, what you could even do was you could add more water to make it easier for mixing, you know, and you could even sort of hand wedge it or something like that, or just get it really kind of really sticky wet clay and really mix it, and then you could just you could, you know, as if you were reclaiming clay, you could just dry it out a bit, and then you could wedge it really thoroughly after that to make your own clay. So the clay, like the recipe, you know, that I use, you could even use just to make normal clay without the defloculant part. You could take out the defloculant part to make the slip. Yeah, okay, so let's do a quick recap. So like, why would potters want to make their own clay? They might want specific color, they might want specific texture, or they might need specific properties. They might need it to be super strong, super smooth, like really translucent, something like that. So another reason is they might want to make sure all the ingredients are mined in a way that is like the least detrimental to the environment, or they might want to make sure their materials are like as locally sourced as possible that go into their clay. And another reason is that it can often be cheaper, and also is that it might cut down the carbon emissions from actually transporting clay to them, because they're not having to like pay for, or you know, spend the CO2 emissions being for the clay, which is quite a lot of percentage of water being transported to them, so they can save on all of that as well. So clay is actually a combination of loads of different ingredients. It can be clay, ball clays, china clays, crushed rocks, and all those ingredients can go together to make clays with for different properties that potters can use for different things. So how I make my clay is I basically measure out china clay, quartz, FFF feldspar, 3 different types of ball clay, high mod, high plas, and blue ball clay with water, and I add a sodium silicate to it to make it into a casting slip. I also add some kitchen roll, bamboo kitchen roll, to make it into like a very strong clay, and I mix all of that together, and then I can use that for casting slip, but then I can also reclaim it back into clay that I can just use on the wheel or use for making stuff like hand building stuff. Yeah, I hope you like enjoyed this episode where I've been speaking to you about like how to make your own clay. Like I was saying to you, you know, making your own clay isn't necessarily something that like lots of potters even do, but it can be great if you want to make your own slip. If you're, you know, going into slip casting, you want to start making lots of work, then yeah, it's definitely something which is like makes your life easier. You're not having to order in loads of slip. You can just kind of make your own slip, which is really good. Yeah, or if you're particularly concerned about, you know, the environmental aspect of your work, you can you know, create a clay with minimal environmental impact by choosing those ingredients really carefully. And like I was saying to you, if you want more information about, you know, pottery ingredients and finding out more about where they've come from, I have books on the Oxford Clay website, which is www.oxfordclay.co.uk/resources for potters is where all the books are just like listed out there, or you can get them from Amazon as well. So yeah, I've loved talking to you today about how to make your own clay, and I hope you found this interesting, like how I actually make my own clay, and yeah, really looking forward to seeing you on the next episode, and until then, wishing you very happy potting, and I'll see you then. Bye bye. Thank you so much for joining me for the Oxford Clay Pottery podcast. If you're interested in learning more about Oxford Clay or eco-conscious pottery, there's so much for you on the Oxford Clay website. There's books, e-courses, there's a blog on there, loads of other podcast episodes, and I can't wait to share it with you. The web address is oxfordclay.co.uk. I'll see you over there.